Hi, my name is Macy Hong, and this is my final presentation for the course, Making the Grade, Crafting Measurable and Meaningful Learning Outcomes. I wanted to create this type of final product because initially my goals for taking this course was so that I would have information and insight to bring back to my colleagues and my team. So as I'm talking through this presentation, I'm going to be speaking as if I were speaking to my team. So I'll just restart from here. Okay, so hey guys, I've been taking this course on advancement courses about writing stronger and more meaningful learning outcomes. And so I just wanted to share with you guys some of my findings. So firstly, I just kind of want to revisit what learning objectives are. Learning objectives are clear, brief statements describing desired learning outcomes of instruction. So I'm sure we've all come across learning objectives as at one point or another in our careers. We've been told to write them on the board or prior to a lesson. And I just want to really stress that learning objectives are different from learning outcomes. And I know that might seem kind of nuanced, but I think it's important to establish that before we move on to our conversation about crafting strong learning outcomes. So that's not to say learning objectives are bad. Learning objectives are great because they are specific skills, values, or attitudes that we want students to be thinking about or knowing or doing throughout a lesson. But learning objectives lead into learning outcomes, and they're not interchangeable. They're definitely not the same thing. Learning outcomes are measurable and capable of being assessed. They are student-centered, and they're essentially what a student will be able to do at the conclusion of an educational activity. So I really like this quote from the Eberly Center for Teaching Excellence, which reads, "When learning outcomes are not clearly stated in terms of the knowledge and skills to gain, students may not understand the teacher's intended goals for the learning and therefore fail to see the value of the learning." So that's why it's so important for us to have strong learning outcomes so that students buy into the learning and they see why it's meaningful. So the benefits of having strong learning outcomes are not only for students themselves, also for us teachers. It'll help us differentiate between procedural and declarative knowledge. So that kind of goes hand in hand with our conversation about proficiency versus mastery. In my mind, procedural knowledge is more so proficiency, and declarative knowledge is more so mastery, right? If a student is able to regurgitate what you are teaching, I feel like that's proficiency. But if they're able to have declarative knowledge, I think in my mind, that's more so mastery. So once we have strong learning outcomes written, that'll also allow students deliberate practice with the intention of reaching that outcome in the foreground of their minds. So lastly, it's also really important that we have strong learning outcomes so that we can ensure validity in our assessments. So this quote from EduPlanet, "Stakeholders and users alike must be able to see which standards are being used, how students are being prepared for the next level concepts, and how they're being assessed consistently." We ask students to do things in the learning outcome, and what we ask them to do and how we assess them at the end, at the conclusion, should be the same. If it's not the same, frustration lies in a student feeling like they were underprepared or misled, or they're frustrated because they're studying for all the wrong things and their successes are not translating in the assessment. So I really liked that the course also gave us kind of like a step-by-step on how to write meaningful learning outcomes. So we want to make sure that outcomes are student-centered, actionable, and measurable. Obviously, student-centered means that the language of the outcome is for students, not for us teachers. Making sure it's actionable. How will a student show mastery of this learning outcome? And lastly, measurable. To what extent or standard do they have to have mastered this learning outcome? So It's pretty straightforward. A, B, C, D, audience, behavior, conditions, and degree. So A is for audience, that's our students, right? So seventh grade students. The B is for behavior. So if we refer to Bloom's taxonomy, there's the action verbs, and we just choose what we want them to do. So for this example, seventh grade students will identify poetic devices. Identify is one of the actionable verbs. The C is for conditions. So for this example, it would be in a cold read poem. The conditions are not always necessary to include, but you do want to have them, you do want to keep them in consideration when crafting outcomes. And then lastly, the degree, to how well or to what extent do you want students to be able to achieve this? So in this example, it's going to be with 90% accuracy. The course also mentioned that you may not always want to include the degree in your learning outcome to students, because sometimes if it's like, for example, 90% accuracy, that can seem kind of daunting for them. So here are some more samples of learning outcomes. I liked this one. I can pose researchable questions on a logical, regional, and or global issue. Notice that they all have actionable verbs, right? Pose questions, select, analyze, integrate sources. So I wanted us to take a look at our own learning targets, we call them, and see if they are actionable and measurable. Do we have high order verbs? Let's start off by just kind of looking at all the verbs in our learning targets, because these are the ones we have posted on our whiteboards, right? But students still don't really know what we're expecting them to do with the skill by the end of a given unit. So for example, I can use details from the text to determine the theme or message of the story. So does that mean that if they use a detail, they have mastery? Or this one, I can logically organize reasons and evidence to support a written claim. I can support, I can use. We want to kind of maybe take a look at our verbs and improve upon them. Now, normally in a team meeting, I would set aside more time and we would start kind of digging into this, but for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to skip forward to the next slide. Okay. So some things to keep in mind as we look at the rest of the learning targets for our unit is backward designs. So stage 1, targets and outcomes, right? That's where we currently are. Stage 2, we then want to make sure that our assessments align with our outcomes, and that we're measuring the same things. And then lastly, stage 3, strategies, resources, and activities. What knowledge and skills will students need in order to perform effectively? And if they're not able to, what activities or skills can we teach or coach or equip the students with so that they can be successful? So that's kind of the intervention piece and the enrichment piece. And then lastly, as we plan these learning outcomes, we want to be sure to keep in mind our 21st century skills. So the 4 C's, right? Communication, collaboration, critical thinking, and creativity. When creating these learning outcomes, yes, we want students to understand foreshadowing in The Outsiders, but we also want them to do more than just be able to identify text within a novel. We want them to think critically or creatively. So I just wanted to kind of bring up these 21st century skills. So these are the key takeaways. And then our next steps are going to be to create learning outcomes for 7th grade essential and fluency standards and targets. I've linked our work document here so we can all just click on that. And then once we're all on the same document, we can get started.